Our first lecture today in MLL 230. This is World Language Communities. So in this lesson, we're going to be talking about language diversity. How is it that we have so many languages? How are they different from each other? What makes them diverse? Who are the speakers in each language? And to begin, we're going to discuss what exactly is language diversity. So when linguists talk about language diversity, we're talking about the coexistence of many different languages in the area. So there might be maybe an official language of an area, or maybe there might be a language in which the country is majority of the speakers from that country speak the language. But we're really talking about the essence that there's not just one variety. There might be one variety that is dominant, but that doesn't enclose all of the varieties that are spoken in a given area. So just to give you an example, in France, they speak French. In the United States, we speak English. So what's wrong with those statements? Those statements are a little too broad, right? Because you can clarify, well, there's lots of North African immigrants who live in France. There's lots of Spanish speakers who live in America. There's lots of different dialects from that, from the communities. So, you could say, okay, in the United States, we speak English, but we also speak Spanish. We also speak Chinese. We also speak Turkish, So we're talking about the different language diversities, the languages that actually exist, and those speakers who speak them, who reside in those countries. So we're not really looking at the official languages or anything that's government determined. We're looking at what are the languages that people actually speak. So in this map from Ethnologue, you'll see that languages differ from all around the world. The more green that a country is on this map, the more linguistically diverse it is. So places in Africa, for example, here you have India. There's lots of different languages that are spoken. You have here in Oceania, very diverse. Whereas the less green that you get, the more homogenous the speakers are. So you're less likely to find people who maybe speak different languages around the area. And so you can kind of see the ranking with the countries that have the highest index of linguistic diversity, and then also the countries with the largest number of spoken languages. So across continents, we can see that Africa has the most the most languages that are spoken, followed by North and South America, Pacific, Asia, Europe. And this might surprise some of you. Maybe it doesn't surprise you. You've taken my class before, to know that there are many different languages, indigenous languages, local languages, that differ from the standard variety. A lot of you might also be maybe a little surprised to know, and when you think about North and South America, you think, okay, maybe it's English and Spanish, but actually there's more languages than just those. You're talking about those indigenous languages. You're talking about different language varieties, those dialects. There's a lot of different language varieties depending on where you go. So when we're thinking about the countries with the most spoken languages, Papua New Guinea really takes the cake. Papua New Guinea is an island located north of Australia. It is densely populated. We'll talk about that, I think, in the next slide. But you can see Indonesia is a close second. Indonesia is a group of islands. And so different people, depending on, their history, their culture, they might speak different languages. Nigeria, India, United States. There's a lot of spoken languages in the United States, living languages. China, a lot of people think, oh, they just speak Chinese in China. But with our next lesson, I'll show you that there's many different varieties of Chinese. Mexico, Cameroon, Australia, Brazil. So in this class, we'll have what's called a case study, where I'll present a singular country and kind of showcase, there's many different languages that are spoken. Maybe there's some of their language conflicts, How do these people in these areas mitigate these language conflicts? So this is, this is important to know that, the world in which we live in is not just black and white. It's very colorful. When we're talking about linguistic diversity, it's very colorful. There are many different languages that are spoken. Just spotlight on Papua New Guinea real quick. Papua New Guinea, again, is located in Oceania, and it only covers about 0.4% of the geographic region of the world, but this is where 13% of languages exist in the world. So when we're talking about language death or language extinction later on, these are taking place in various places around the world, but also in Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea hosts some of the highest languages, the highest speakers, because there's lots of different communities. And we'll talk about later about what are the factors that impact whether a region is very high in linguistically diversity, or it's low in linguistically diversity. So, how many languages are spoken in the world today? There are about 7,000 languages in this world, and that's and found in about 200 independent countries. This also includes languages that are not spoken. So this also includes sign language. And if you take in my previous classes, you know that American Sign Language differs from British Sign Language. There's also there's languages with millions of speakers, right? But on the other end of the spectrum, there's languages that are at risk. There's kind of dwindling number of speakers, and linguists are trying to record or try to capture those languages before they go away. One thing that we know is that less people speak more languages and more people speak less number of languages. You probably know that traveling the world, right? If you've ever been to Africa, you know that a person living in Africa might speak 6, 7, 8 languages, depending on the area. And if you go somewhere, where people are more monolingual, like the United States, it is more of a factor that people. It's more common that you'll see people speak more languages, but you'll have more people speak less number of languages. 94% of languages have been spoken by 6% of the people, and 6% of languages are spoken by 94% of the people. You could probably make these metaphors to income, right? About what percentage of wealth one person has, right? So as you can see here, like we showed you in the last slide with Papua New Guinea, it's only a very, very small percentage of the world, but this is where a lot of people speak a lot of different languages. And really, one thing that you should really get from the course is that multilingualism is a norm. It is more normal for people to be multilingual. And so to be multilingual, it means that it's the ability of societies, institutions, groups, and individuals to engage on a regular basis with more than one language in their day-to-day lives. So this means that, when people coexist with one another around the world, they're more likely to exchange or interact in more than one language. When you, if you're walking to a store, maybe you'll speak one language to the store attendant, and that might be a different language from what you have at home. Some of you might feel this way about dialects. Some people perceive dialects as being other languages. It is a very, very, very common for someone to speak more than one language. It is not very common for someone to be monolingual. Right, so it's a normal phenomenon. Experts know that multilingualism is not an aberration or minority phenomenon. Many English speakers suppose it to be. It is, on the contrary, a normal and unremarkable necessity for the majority of the world's population. And some of you probably already notice when you travel abroad, you see people be able to exercise their linguistic skills. And it's not something to where maybe they do notice it on a daily basis, but I think it's just normal for them. Like if you were to ask them, like, what languages do you speak to and why, they would kind of find that question to be weird, because this is something that has always existed within their linguistic community. So just to give you some examples of, multilingual communities, here are some signs, right? If you go to a foreign country and you see the different signs that they have, what does that mean about their linguistic community? What does it mean to be multilingual? Why would they have different languages on these signs, right? What is the point? And for the most part, it's because you want to include all the members of that community, right? You'll notice this with a lot of communities, especially in Baltimore, in Highlandtown or other areas. You'll see things translated in Spanish. And because they want to be more inclusive of those communities, they know it's a predominantly Spanish speaking community. Same thing here. You'll see different, if you fly in an airplane, or if you just read in the back of your shampoo bottle, you'll see that things are translated in both Spanish and French. And that's because they want a wide variety of speakers. They want to reach a lot of people. So if you're going to sell to North America, you better have things in English. You better have things translated in Spanish, also in French, right? And so this is a good sign to see what are the linguistic communities around you, right? If you see something in French and in German and in English, it could be that you're on a Swiss airplane, where all these languages are frequently spoken, right? If you see this hairstylist right here, she has, or they have, a lot of different, words for hairdresser, hairstylist, right? So maybe this is a sign to indicate that there's a lot of different linguistic communities going on. Maybe this is a very tourist area, right? And maybe they need to reach as many people as possible. So when we have linguistic diversity, it's really an inclusion. It's really making sure that people are able to understand one another, and be able to, you're really including people. You're not keeping people out and saying, oh, sorry that you don't speak French. I guess you won't know these these seatbelt instructions on this plane, right? No, you want to be able to be inclusive, and that's this is very common in a multilingual community. We'll talk a bit later about one of the conflicts that occur, but for the most part, multilingualism, very, very normal. What about multilingualism in the world today? There's increasing linguistic and cultural diversity in Western societies. This might be because, now that we have the access to technology, right? So, for example, we're able to kind of use Google Translate with people that we might not share the same language with, right? And also the spread of English. One time I asked Jody Crandall, who used to be the head of Center for Applied Linguistics. I asked her, well, if most of the world speaks Mandarin, wouldn't it be the case that, Mandarin should be the language that all speakers should learn? And she said, actually, there's more English speakers in China than there are English speakers in the United States. And I thought that was very interesting, because she's referring to the fact that people want to know English, people want to learn English. Me being a career ESL teacher, I've been an ESL teacher for 11 years, and I find this, the field to be exploding, right? Because people really want to know English. Anywhere you go, the youth, the young people are learning English in schools. They want to know English. They are using English, in on online spaces. So this is really also spreading multilingualism, this proliferation of English as a medium. So now we're getting to why we have so many languages. What are the factors that allow for linguistic diversity? And it could be from evolution, right? So there's two prominent theories of how languages have evolved. The first one is monogenesis. So this is the theory that all the languages have evolved from Africa. So kind of like our single ancestor, right? Like there was a someone from Africa who was our who was our ancestor, and we all descended from this one person. So that's a monogenesis theory of linguistic evolution. The polygenesis theory of linguistic evolution talks about um, instead of maybe just one ancestor, maybe there are multiple ancestors. Maybe people are early, caveman, cave woman, cave person, uh, you know, ancestors all spoke different languages, and then our languages derive from that. So we're not really sure, and the reason why we're not really sure is because nothing was written down, right? Spoken language is something that people have spoken for a lot of for centuries, right? And a lot of cultures are, carry those language through oral storytelling. But the fact of the matter is, if you didn't write it down, it's very difficult to kind of for us to piece it together and say, okay, this is where language came from, or these people spoke this. We kind of have to use our imagination. But we're able to look at genetics, right? And and the genetics really point to this monogenesis or the single ancestor theory. So this geneticist from UPenn's Sarah Tishkoff says pretty much every study that's ever been done involving looking at genetic variation in Africans compared to non-Africans always show more diversity in Africans. Modern humans have been in Africa longer than any other region in the world. Okay, so they're able to kind of look at the genetics and say, okay, we all basically are from the same genetic code, and it is looking that the genetic variation in Africa is the source of this code. But other linguists have other theories, right? And looking at the genetic code, they said, okay, Jonathan Lowe and David Harmon said there's huge linguistic diversity in Africa, but it's not concentrated in Africa in the same way as genetic diversity. Languages evolve so much faster. Cultural evolution is so much faster than biological evolution. So if the biological evidence is there that we are from Africa, we are out of Africa theory is what they call it. These linguists say, okay, so yeah, genetically, whatever, like, our genetic code can be there, but it doesn't necessarily mean that our linguistic code is there. That means that it's not necessarily the fact that just because our genetic code was found in Africa, people born from different places can speak different codes. You can have an American baby born in China, and that baby will grow up speaking Chinese, right? So languages are a little bit more flexible than our genetic code. So a second factor could be population movement. So obviously, when a community moves somewhere, they are isolated from the original language. This is true in case of immigration, right? A lot of children of immigrants, myself included, I'm a child of immigrants, and my parents' ability to speak Chinese is way better than my ability to speak Chinese because I'm isolated from the original language. It also speaks to diversification. So you have local social conditions and then contact with those local languages. So when you're able to move from one place to another, it's not like your language is a vacuum, right? Your language is constantly being molded by your environment. And so if you're moving somewhere, then you'll have contact with more languages. So your original languages change. And this also, maybe there's a hybrid, right? Maybe there's a pidgin where there's two contact languages, like, like Nigerian English, right? Like local languages of Nigeria, and English colonialists, like when they came, they had to develop a contact language or a pidgin, which turned into a Creole. These are the results of contact languages. So a language family, when linguists kind of piece together languages that are related, they call it a language family. This is a group of languages with a common ancestor. In the most popular, of course, is Indo-European, right? This is like this includes English and a lot of European languages. So of course, there's going to be a lot of speakers because we just discussed how a lot of people in the world speak English nowadays. But it also includes Sino-Tibetan, Niger-Congo, Afro-Asiatic, and a host of number of other languages. But if you look at the not only the speakers, but also the number of languages within this family, you'll notice a different trend. So, for example, like we said, Africa hosts one of the most diverse places, and you'll see that the Niger Congo has a lot of different languages that it represents, right? Dogon, Sangos, Swahili, Wolof, Yoruba, Zulu, right? And the indigenous languages of sub-Saharan Africa. Remember how, Indonesian, right, was or one of the most linguistic diverse places. You'll see here that Austronesian, right? This is a language family that includes Hawaiian, Javanese, Malay, Tagalog. It's spoken on these different islands of Southeast Asia. So you can kind of see that, kind of what I was speaking to at the beginning of this PowerPoint, that even if you have the most number of speakers, like this Indo-European family has the most number of speakers, is a big family, it doesn't mean that those people in the family are diverse, right? As diverse as these families here. So let's just take a look at the Proto-European language, the Proto-European family, okay? So this is the hypothetical, which means that we don't really know, but we're piecing together from the languages that are very close to each other. The hypothetical common ancestor of the Indo-European languages spoken by the Proto-Indo-Europeans. And proto just means like before, right? So this is before, English, before Latin, before, Spanish, before French. So, we're thinking with migration, everyone kind of moved around Europe before, 6000 BP, before common period. And so that is why we have such a diffusion of these early Indo-European language dialects. So here we have today, why did languages, we have a language family, and the reason why so many languages are so common, right? Why is Italian sounds so close to Spanish, sounds so close to French to some speakers, right? It's because we had this migration throughout Europe, and so with the slow migration, you'll have a lot of shared ancestry. Proto-Indo-European language, which, is split up into different families, just like you have a different family tree, right? So, we have Germanic, some Germanic roots, right? Some Celtic, Celtic roots, some Italic, some Hellenic, even Sanskrit. Sanskrit's part of this language family, right? So that's how linguists are kind of able to piece together what are the languages that are closely related, right? Closely related languages. They say, okay, well, we see that some words look very similar to other words. So that means that they're closely related. But are all languages related? Not necessarily, right? So the presence of diverse structural features in a language, maybe, irrespective of the families of the languages they belong. So these areas are called a linguistic area. So linguistic area, a geographic region containing a group of 3 or more languages that share some structural features as a result of contact rather than a result of accident or inheritance from a common ancestor. So that means that sometimes, related back to the origins of language, sometimes the languages started out being related, right? Like I came from one tribe, I spoke a language, you're speaking a language, and then you moved far away, and then your language, became a little bit different. But it's not necessarily, just because you have structural features, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're related and that we spoke the same language to begin with. It could be a result of contact, which means that, French and Spanish might have a common ancestor, but they might just be similar because they're next to each other, right? Like if you're from a border town, you're going to be able to speak, both languages, very, very, fluently. So you can go back and forth between those two, right? So that's what makes language a little bit tricky, kind of related to the definition that the linguist talked about. Like it's not necessarily genetic code. Sometimes it's about context. Sometimes it's about, not only am I migrating somewhere, but I'm also close to you. So my language will change to be close to you. Another reason is war. War can divide populations that once spoke a common language, so new languages form. We'll talk a little bit later about language death, right? So like when you're at war and your side loses, they don't want to have to speak your language. You have to speak the winner's language, right? Like the ones who are conquered are forced to speak the language of their conquerors. So you'll have a little bit less diversity here. So yeah, throughout history, you'll learn, okay, so-and-so won this war, so-and-so won that war. And usually the conquerors of the language will eradicate whatever language you spoke before and will introduce their language and make it mandatory. So like if you decide to speak your local language, and they don't like that, right? So they kind of pressure you into it or they kill you. Borders. You'll see this with a lot of borders, right? Like the borders really represent is the aftermath of all these long wars. People going around Europe conquering, whatever, Vikings coming and bringing their language, or Napoleon coming and, changing the language. And so, you'll be able to see a lot of these different languages depending on these warring factions, right? And just take a look at some of these languages. I mean, what I mentioned earlier about, just because you're from Spain doesn't always mean that you'll speak Spanish, right? Sometimes you'll speak Catalan, Basque, Galician, right? So there's lots of different language varieties that we have here. Just to bring it back home, and this is in your textbook, but the borders of, of United States and Mexico were drawn from political lines, right? So it wasn't that we've always had the United States always looked this way and then Mexico always looked this way. It was like one day there was like a big war, and then one day, the people residing in Mexico woke up and they were suddenly American, right? It was just kind of these lines that they drew, right, to colonize North and South America. And so this border of Texas and Coahuila, I think, tries to mark these different places. And so that, that also shows you that even with these political lines, like people still speak different languages. They're able to, just because you live within a border of a certain language doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily speak this as your dominant language. You might speak it as a second language, but, these are an aftermath of warfare, right? Of borders, border drawing. Geography. So geography is one of the a big factor into why languages are diverse, because languages aren't necessarily spread even among the planet. Just like there's not a lot of the whole planet doesn't look all the same, right? It's not homogenous. And just to give an example of Papua New Guinea from before, the geography of Papua New Guinea is very mountainous. It's very jungly. There's lots of isolated valleys, right? And if one community can't access another community, right? And this is, I don't know, before they had internet. How are they going to be able to speak to each other? They won't be able to, right? So if it's very jungly, it's very hilly, then people are going to develop their own language because you have that kind of geographic isolation. Here's a story about a Turkic whistling language, right? So instead of speaking, this language is whistled. And this is very interesting, right? Because you would never think about languages being, you can think about languages being signed and maybe spoken, but whistled? This is an aftermath of the fact that they live in a very, very hilly, very mountainous place, right? And so in a mountainous place, if you yell, people are not really going to hear you. But if you whistle, your message can probably, spread faster than if you just yelled something. But again, the geographic terrain really makes a difference. There's also more languages found in tropical regions than in temperate zones. So, the tropical island of Papua New Guinea has 900 languages, right? Russia is larger by size, but it only has 105. But also, doesn't it's not only the size. It's not saying like the smaller you are or the more densely populated you are, you're going to speak different languages, because Vanuatu, they speak 110 languages, but in Bangladesh, they speak 41. So someone can be highly populated, right? But still speak very similar languages, right? And this could be also, this is temperature related. If people are, it's very interesting because I feel like even in Russia, they're, they might be more distantly located, but they still will probably speak Russian, right? And that has to do a little bit more with politics than I think it does with geography. Rain could have an effect. So if we're to assume that people will move to fill spaces where no one else lives, so when you go to explore a new land, hopefully you're not going to tread upon someone else's land, although that has happened, colonialism. But you're going to go somewhere where no one else lives, right? So but you really have to think about rainfall. Like, if it rains a lot, then maybe you want to, the rainfall will limit the number of people that can live in a place. But also, this is an assumption. The model assumed that people would live in a higher density where it rained more. So it is assumed that human populations have a maximum size. There's only a certain amount of growth that we can go before it starts to be too much. So in this model, when a population grew larger than the maximum threshold, it divided into two populations, each speaking a distinct language. So even the fact of the weather can have a effect on how you speak a language. And they did a model where they said, okay, we're going to observe this land. Obviously, it's Australia. And they ran a model that said, okay, we're going to look at the language richness, right? We're also going to look at the amount of rain. So the more rain that they have, we think the more linguistically diverse it's going to have, right? And so they were able to map it, and they found that the places where, so it's like in the red, orange, yellow, right? Yellow, green are the more densely populated, versus the places in blue are not densely populated, depending on the rainfall. And you can kind of see that's true, right? And Australia might be a different case, but you can see that, the major populated cities are located around the coast, right? And are located on this little tip right here. So this theory proves true for Australia. Acoustic adaptation. So again, with the geography, with the temperature, you're thinking about languages that originated in warm areas with densely covered tree tend to use less consonants and were instead characterized by a higher prevalence of vowel sounds. And so we think that the clicks in the Khoisan language, and here's a video demonstrating what I mean by that, they're able to use more vowels, right? Because if there's so many trees, like I'm not going to hear the difference between a P and a B or a T and a D, right? I'm going to be able to say, okay, I can kind of figure out what you're saying by these vowel sounds. Or maybe these clicks were developed to kind of be a little bit more of a drastic pronunciation in this language. So what are some other factors that are missing? Obviously culture, obviously identity, right? So, language defines a speaker. It gives them an identity, the insurance of cultural belonging. It gives you a sense of culture, right? So this also ensures your protection and your survival of the language. If your language is associated with a culture and an identity, and people are very passionate about this, about your culture, about your identity, of course your language is going to survive, right? Because if you're not passionate about it, if your great grandparents spoke German and you're like, okay, well, that's cool, but I don't want to learn German, your future family's not going to learn German. German's not going to survive in your family, right? So you want to have to, it's not only geography and rain and, temperature, like all these things are important. But the matter of fact is we're all human, and as humans, our mode of communication using language, right, is something that needs to be important to us in order to survive. We're going to talk a little bit about language endangerment, although I do talk about this later in different slides. But, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the world, speaks a few languages, and such few of the world speak a lot of languages. So that means that if those speakers die, then their language becomes endangered, right? So, an endangerment represents an unfair situation in which the natural existence of a being is under threat. People like to relate this to biological species, right? Like the species of a certain plant is dying, right? Or a rainforest is dying. They think about that, like they think linguistic language is along the same lines, right? Where language endangerment represents a set of unsafe phenomenon of language vitality with a different degree of endangerment, where a specific language or a group of languages are potentially in danger. In danger means like it's going to die out. That means like the speakers no longer will speak it, right? So on the opposite end, we talk about language variety, vitality, to indicate the ability of a language to endure as an individual language in a multilingual environment. Because if you have so many different languages in an environment, how do you make sure that your language is going to survive? Some of the languages that have been endangered in the past, I think they're still endangered, but the Celtic language, Breton, spoken in Brittany, France, right? And so if you go to Brittany, you'll see that there's a lot of signs, right? And then obviously the first is in French, and the second is in Breton, right? But how much of the population actually speaks it? How much of the, French government do they promote this language, right? Are they more likely to promote standard French instead? Here we have a Welsh language. It's an actual name of a town, right? And I think they wrote it like how you would pronounce it. But this is located in Wales, right? And so, I once had a speaker I met someone from Wales, and I said, oh, do you speak Welsh? And he was like, oh, like barely, right? He barely speaks Welsh. But he notices like if he enrolled in a university in Wales, and all of the documents were first in Welsh and then in English, right? So this is kind of the government response to promoting language vitality, right? And in case of endangerment, they don't want these communities have such a strong culture and identity. They don't want their language to go away. So what do? So here's 9 factors of language vitality, right? And these are really the factors of how a language is able to survive. How many numbers of speakers are there? Are they communicating via generations, right? Are they able to say, okay, my mom speaks this and I'm going to teach it to my children, or my father speaks this, I'm going to teach it to my children? What are the community members' attitudes toward their language? Because if your language is being laughed or mocked, or no one wants to speak your language, everyone thinks that's the language of quote unquote, like, non-polite people, or, poor people or something like that. They're not gonna want to speak that language. Shifts in domain, right? Domains being, for example, school or home or work, right? So if your language is not spoken at work and you spend more time at work, like how vital is this language? What is the what is the probability that you're going to pass this language down to your children? Same thing for government, institutional language attitudes and policies, including official status and use. So if your language has an official status, we'll talk a little bit later in this class about what I mean by, what are the official languages. But are they recognized by the government? Is the government said, this is a language of our country? Type and quality of documentation. So is your language well documented? Is it on the internet, right? Are Wikipedia articles written in this language? If not, how do you have access to it, right? Response to new domains and media. So, what is new? TikTok, right? If they don't have a TikTok in your language, are you going to continue with this language, right? Ability of materials for language education and literacy. So do you have opportunities to speak this to your children? Is it just you, or is there a community? Can I take my child to a museum where this language will be spoken? Are there materials? Are there books in this language? Are there movies in this language? Proportion of speakers within the total population. So, for me, I grew up being the only Chinese person, in my class. So am I more likely or less likely to speak Chinese? I am less likely to speak Chinese, right? So, it all depends. If you grew up in a big Korean American community and you're non-Korean, you'll probably pick up some Korean because, just like the proportion of speakers in your area speak this language. So these are some factors which are different from the factors that we talked about, language diversity. These are factors in which a language is able to keep alive, right? You're able to pass on this language. There's also intergenerational language transmission. And it exists on a gradient from safe to extinct. So we know a language is safe if it's used by children. And it starts to get a little bit more unsafe when the children only use it at home. They don't use it with their friends. They don't use it at school, right? It's endangered when it's being used mostly by parents and higher, grandparents and higher, great-grandparents are higher, and it becomes extinct when there exists no speaker, right? So this is part of a community. We're talking about a very community terms, although in your family it might be very similar, right? But in community, if a language is only spoken by the great-grandparents, those great-grandparents are going to die soon, right? And if the children don't pick it up, they're not really going to learn it. They're not going to speak it. So what are some ways in which you can counter this, right? And your book talks about, the prevalence of schools. So schools, education plays a big role. Schools are a part of society um, in which they allow for, language acquisition, language contact, language use in society. So you'll see a lot of in the news, and maybe grew up in one of these communities, or maybe you know someone who grew up in like a multilingual education, like you went to a Spanish English dual language school or a French immersion school, or you grew up in a school in which you went to a school in which a lot of languages were represented. Not just like I had Spanish class every Tuesday, but a kind of a series where both languages are respected, one or more languages are being taught on a daily basis. This is really how we're able to kind of reverse this language transmission. We'll talk a little bit more later on this in future classes as well. So the last question I want to lead you with before we get into our discussion board questions is, should we mourn language death? Like, what's the big deal? If a language dies, right, is that such like the end of the world, right? And there's this quote from Krauss that says, surely just as the extinction of any animal species diminishes our world, so does the extinction of any language. Surely we linguists know, and the general public can sense, that any language is a supreme achievement of a uniquely human collective genius, as divine and endless a mystery as a living organism. Should we mourn the loss of Eyak or Ibik any less than the loss of a panda or a California condor, right? So, in talking about the connections to like the animal world, what happens if we lose a panda, right? Like, I'm just gonna say pandas don't really contribute much to society. They're cute, right? But they eat bamboo, and bamboo's costly. You can only grow bamboo in one place, right? So like, why do we need to have a panda, right? And some people argue, pandas are one of its kind. This is kind of the essence of, of a living creature. And yes, they're cute. So I think that people can make the a similar argument about language here, right? And to close, here are some discussion board questions. Make sure to answer 2 of them and to follow the word count limit that is listed on the syllabus. So, number 1, how does language intersect with culture identity? Can you give examples? Number 2, have you been in an environment of multilingualism? What were the language represented, and what did the multitude of languages reveal about the environment? And then number 3, how do you propose we celebrate language diversity and combat language extinction? I'm very interested to hear your thoughts, and I'll see you on the discussion board.